John chapter 19 verses 14 to 16 and 31 to 35. Young's literal translation. And it was the preparation of the Passover, and as it were the 6th hour, and he said to the Jews, Lo your king, and take right out. Take away, crucify him. Pilate said to them, Your king shall I crucify? The chief priests answered, We have no king except Caesar. Then, therefore, he delivered him up to them, that he may be crucified. And they took Jesus and led him away. The Jews, therefore, that the bodies might not remain on the cross on the Sabbath, since it was the preparation, for that Sabbath day was a great one, asked of Pilate that their legs may be broken, and they taken away. The soldiers therefore came, and of the first indeed they did break the legs, and of the other who was crucified with him. And having come to Jesus, when they saw him already having been dead, they did not break his legs. But one of the soldiers with a spear did pierce his side, and immediately there came forth blood and water. And he who had seen had testified, and his testimony is true. And that one had known that true things he speaketh, that ye also may believe. What did John mean when he said the Sabbath day following Christ's crucifixion was a great one? To understand what the great Sabbath meant to the Jews, let us take a look at this verse using the Orthodox Jewish Bible translation. John chapter 19 verse 31. Orthodox Jewish Bible. Therefore, those of Yehudah, since it was preparation day, they did not want the geviyot to be left on HaEtz tree during Shabbos, for it was Shabbat HaGadol, requested Pilate to have the legs broken and the geviyot taken away. What is a Shabbat HaGadol? Shabbat HaGadol, literally translated as Great Sabbath, is the weekly Sabbath immediately before Passover. This means that Shabbat HaGadol can range from one day before Passover, like in the calendar year 2008, to a maximum of 7 days before Passover, like in the calendar year 2016, depending of course on what day of the week the Passover falls. So John is telling us that Christ was crucified the day before a Shabbat HaGadol, which means Christ was crucified on a Friday. Furthermore, John also tells us that the day Christ was crucified was the preparation of the Passover. Nisan 14 is usually when the preparation of the Passover is observed. However, when this day falls on a Sabbath, like in the calendar year 2008, where no work is to be done, the preparation is done one day earlier on Nisan 13 instead. And this was the case on the year Christ was crucified, when the preparation of the Passover was observed on Friday, the 13th of Nisan, and not on the 14th of Nisan, which was a Shabbat HaGadol or Great Sabbath. And since Shabbat HaGadol is the Sabbath immediately before Passover, this means Nisan 15, or the Passover at the time of Christ's crucifixion, occurred on Sunday, or just one day after this Shabbat HaGadol. We are told that Christ was resurrected very early in the morning of the first day of the week, or Sunday. Luke chapter 24 verses 1 to 8. On the first day of the week, very early in the morning, the women took the spices they had prepared and went to the tomb. They found the stone rolled away from the tomb, but when they entered, they did not find the body of the Lord Jesus. While they were wondering about this, suddenly 2 men in clothes that gleamed like lightning stood beside them. In their fright, the women bowed down with their faces to the ground. But the men said to them, "Why do you look for the living among the dead? He is not here. He has risen. Remember how he told you while he was still with you in Galilee? The Son of Man must be delivered over to the hands of sinners, be crucified, and on the third day be raised again." Then they remembered his words. Thus, Christ died on Friday the 13th of Nisan and not on the 14th, contrary to what most Bible interpreters claim. And Christ was resurrected very early in the morning of Sunday, the 15th of Nisan, which was also the day of the Passover. Please keep in mind that a Jewish day ends on sundown of that day, but starts from sundown of the previous day. Thus, the preparation of the Passover on Friday, the 13th of Nisan, ended on sundown of that day, but actually started on sundown of the previous day, which was on Thursday. And it was on Thursday night that Christ celebrated his Last Supper with his disciples. The fast of the firstborn, Hebrew Tanit Pecherot, is a unique fast day in Judaism which usually falls on the day before Passover, that is, the 14th day of Nisan. This fast commemorates the salvation of the Israelite firstborns during the plague of the firstborn at the time of the Exodus and on the day of the Passover. As with most Jewish fast days, the fast begins at dawn and continues until nightfall. If the day before Passover, or Nisan 14, falls on Sabbath, most authorities rule that the fast is set for the previous Thursday, starting from dawn of Nisan 12 until sundown, which is just before the start or eve of Friday, the 13th of Nisan. This is because it is forbidden to fast on Sabbath, and fasts are preferably not set for Friday. This was the case in the year Christ was crucified, as well as in the calendar year 2008. One of the things done during preparation of the Passover is the search for chametz, or leavened foods that are forbidden on this Jewish holiday. Normally, the search for chametz occurs on the start or eve of the 14th of Nisan, which is one night before the start or eve of Passover. When the start or eve of Nisan 14 is on a Friday night, which is also when the start or eve of Sabbath is observed, the search for chametz takes place one night earlier, or Thursday night, which in this case is also the start or eve of the 13th of Nisan. This is because the use of a candle at night, the search for chametz, and the act of burning chametz the following morning are forbidden on Sabbath, which in this case falls on the 14th of Nisan and is a great Sabbath as well. Thus, the search for chametz using a candle is done on Thursday night instead, and the chametz found is burned on Friday morning. I mentioned earlier that Christ ate his Last Supper on Thursday night, which was already the start of the 13th of Nisan, and which on that particular year was also the preparation for the Passover. And it is during this night that the search for chametz, or leaven, takes place for the purpose of burning them the following morning. Obviously, this night is really the first night during the entire Passover festival when only unleavened bread are allowed in the dining table. This is what Matthew meant when he said this night was the first day of unleavened bread. Note that Matthew did not say it was the first day of the festival of unleavened bread, as some translations like the King James Version say. Matthew chapter 26 verse 17, King James Version. Now the first day of the feast of unleavened bread, the disciples came to Jesus, saying unto him, Where wilt thou that we prepare for thee to eat the Passover? If you look at Strong's Concordance for this particular verse, you can see that the word feast or festival is not originally included there, but was merely inserted in brackets by the King James Version translation. This is why other translations choose to translate the same verse this way. Matthew chapter 26 verse 17, Revised Standard Version. Now on the first day of unleavened bread, the disciples came to Jesus, saying, Where will you have us prepare for you to eat the Passover? Matthew chapter 26 verse 17, the Complete Jewish Bible. On the first day for Matzah, the Talmidim came to Yeshua and asked, Where do you want us to prepare your Seder? Note that the word festival or feast is not found in these translations. And this is important because this Thursday night was not the first day of the seventh-day festival of unleavened bread, which is celebrated immediately after the Passover, or in this case, on sundown of Sunday on the 15th of Nisan. This Thursday night was merely the first day when only unleavened bread are allowed to be eaten, or can be eaten, since chametz, or all leavened foods, are being searched this night for the purpose of burning them the following morning. Mark and Luke gave us a parallel account of this verse, and it is interesting to note that this time the King James Version does not include the word festival or feast in its translations. Mark chapter 14 verse 12, King James Version. And the first day of unleavened bread, when they killed the Passover, his disciples said unto him, Where wilt thou that we go and prepare, that thou mayest eat the Passover? Luke chapter 22 verses 7 to 9, King James Version. Then came the day of unleavened bread, when the Passover must be killed. And he sent Peter and John, saying, Go and prepare us the Passover, that we may eat. And they said unto him, Where wilt thou that we prepare? The sacrificial animal or the Paschal lamb is slain on the 14th of Nisan, starting at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. But what happens when the 14th of Nisan falls on a Sabbath, like in the year when Christ was crucified? According to Hillel, a famous Jewish religious leader, Even if the afternoon of the 14th of Nisan falls on a Sabbath, the Paschal lamb is still sacrificed, the blood sprinkled on the altar, the entrails removed and cleansed, and the fat offered on the altar. For these four ceremonies in the case of the Paschal lamb, and these alone, according to Hillel, were exempt from the prohibition against working on the Sabbath. However, this regulation that the Sabbath yielded the precedence to the Passover was not definitely determined until the time of Hillel, who established it as a law. Now Hillel was born on 110 BC and died on 10 AD. Was this ruling by Hillel that the Paschal lamb should be sacrificed on the afternoon of Nisan 14, even if it is a Sabbath, still being followed in the year Christ was crucified? If we are to believe Mark's and Luke's account of Christ's crucifixion, then according to them, the Paschal lamb was to be sacrificed on the day Christ had his Last Supper. This day on Nisan 13, as I already mentioned earlier, started on sundown on Thursday and ended on sundown on Friday. Mark chapter 14 verse 12. And the first day of unleavened bread, when they killed the Passover, his disciples said unto him, Where wilt thou that we go and prepare, that thou mayest eat the Passover? Luke chapter 22 verses 7 to 9. Then came the day of unleavened bread, when the Passover must be killed. And he sent Peter and John, saying, Go and prepare us the Passover, that we may eat. And they said unto him, Where wilt thou that we prepare? Thus, according to the Gospels, when the 14th of Nisan falls on a Sabbath, and is therefore a Shabbat HaGadol, or a great Sabbath, the Paschal lamb should be sacrificed on the afternoon of the 13th of Nisan, which is a Friday, and in this particular case is also the day of preparation of the Passover. Thus, Christ died on the cross at the very hour when the Paschal lambs were being sacrificed that day. Now, although the Paschal lamb is sacrificed on the afternoon of Nisan 13, whenever Nisan 14 is a Sabbath, the carcass of the Paschal lamb is not roasted over fire and eaten until the start of Nisan 15, or Passover day, which in this case was sundown on Saturday. Also, the Paschal lamb should be consumed completely before the following morning, and if there were any leftovers, it should be burned before Sunday morning. Exodus chapter 12 verses 8 to 10. That same night, they are to eat the meat roasted over the fire, along with bitter herbs and bread made without yeast. Do not eat the meat raw or boiled in water, but roast it over a fire, with the head, legs, and internal organs. Do not leave any of it till morning. If some is left till morning, you must burn it. Thus, the carcass of the Paschal lamb and its roasted meat is in the possession of the Jewish family that sacrificed it, starting from the afternoon of Nisan 13, when the lamb was sacrificed, until before the morning of Nisan 15, when the roasted meat should be fully consumed. And this time period is exactly the amount of time Christ spent buried in his grave. Since there will be a little more than 24 hours starting from Friday afternoon and ending at sundown on Saturday, before the carcass of the Paschal lamb is roasted over fire. The raw meat of the Paschal lamb should be preserved properly to prevent it from rotting. Ancient ways of preserving raw meat without refrigeration includes burying it underground. If buried where the earth is very cold, the earth acts like a refrigerator. Some berries, leaves, bulbs, roots, and stems are known to contain substances that inhibit bacterial growth. In some plants, the concentrations of these compounds is so high that they could be used to preserve foods. Thus, the raw meat of the Paschal lamb is first wrapped with various herbs and berries before burying it underground in order to preserve it and also to kill pathogenic bacteria. Interestingly, during the time the carcass of the Paschal lamb is being preserved by Jewish households, Christ's lifeless body was buried inside an artificial cave where the temperature is relatively cooler after being anointed with anti-inflammatory and antibacterial spices and wrapped in linen. John chapter 19 verses 38 to 40. Later, Joseph of Arimathea asked Pilate for the body of Jesus. Now Joseph was a disciple of Jesus, but secretly because he feared the Jewish leaders. With Pilate's permission, he came and took the body away. He was accompanied by Nicodemus, the man who earlier had visited Jesus at night. Nicodemus brought a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 75 pounds. Taking Jesus' body, the two of them wrapped it with the spices in strips of linen. This was in accordance with Jewish burial customs. Myrrh and aloes are known for their anti-inflammatory and antibacterial properties as far back as the time of Aristotle, circa 4th century BC, and certainly during Christ's crucifixion. Moses instructed Israel that as early as the 10th of Nisan, the Paschal lamb should have been chosen already and taken care of in their households until they are slaughtered in the afternoon of Nisan 14. Exodus chapter 12 verses 3 to 6. Tell the whole community of Israel that on the 10th day of this month, each man is to take a lamb for his family, one for each household. If any household is too small for a whole lamb, they must share one with their nearest neighbor, having taken into account the number of people there are. You are to determine the amount of lamb needed in accordance with what each person will eat. The animals you choose must be year-old males without defect, and you may take them from the sheep or the goats. Take care of them until the 14th day of the month, when all the members of the community of Israel must slaughter them at twilight. The Paschal lambs are chosen and taken care of in Jewish households exactly 4 days before they are sacrificed, starting from the 10th of Nisan until the 14th. But what happens when the Paschal lamb is sacrificed on the 13th of Nisan instead of the 14th, like in the year Christ was crucified? Should the Paschal lamb be chosen on the 10th of Nisan or 1 day earlier on the 9th? I believe the Paschal lamb should be chosen on the 9th of Nisan, which is still 4 days before it is sacrificed on the 13th, and also 6 days before Passover Day on the 15th of Nisan. And I believe this is the reason while Christ made his triumphal entry into Jerusalem, coming from Bethany 6 days and not 5 days before Passover. John chapter 12 verses 1 to 2. 6 days before the Passover, Jesus came to Bethany, where Lazarus lived, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. Here, a dinner was given in Jesus' honor. Martha served, while Lazarus was among those reclining at the table with him. Christ came to Bethany after sundown, which is why he was served at dinner meal. Now Passover day on Nisan 15 actually starts on sundown of Nisan 14 and ends on sundown of Nisan 15. 6 days before the start of Passover on sundown of Nisan 14 is sundown of Nisan 8. Now sundown of Nisan 8 is actually the start or eve of Nisan 9, which ends on sundown the following day. We are told that Christ entered Jerusalem the following day or morning after his dinner meal in Bethany on sundown of Nisan 8. This means Christ entered Jerusalem in the morning of Nisan 9. John chapter 12 verses 9 to 15. The common people therefore of the Jews learned that he was there in Bethany, and they came, not for Jesus' sake only, but that they might see Lazarus also, whom he had raised from the dead. But the chief priests took counsel that they might put Lazarus also to death, because that by reason of him many of the Jews went away and believed on Jesus. On the morrow, a great multitude that had come to the feast, when they heard that Jesus was coming to Jerusalem, took the branches of the palm trees and went forth to meet him and cried out, Hosanna, blessed is he that cometh in the name of the Lord, even the King of Israel. Now many people, including prominent pastors, are rejecting a Friday crucifixion and a Sunday resurrection merely because of the following statement by Christ. Matthew chapter 12 verses 39 to 40. He answered, A wicked and adulterous generation asks for a sign, but none will be given it except the sign of the prophet Jonah. For as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of a huge fish, so the Son of Man will be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. These people are saying that it is impossible for Christ to be buried 3 days and 3 nights in his grave if his crucifixion was on Friday afternoon and his resurrection was on or shortly before Sunday morning. In one of my next videos, I will be discussing this topic.